A man's life was forever changed when a single mistake led to the disappearance of his daughter on a train. It took 20 long years before he finally uncovered the shocking truth about what really happened that fateful day. Jared Stark was leaving work, feeling tired after another long day. He worked in a factory, and the long hours left him exhausted. As he walked towards his daughter Kelly's school to pick her up, his mind was split between his tiredness and the excitement of seeing her. Kelly was only 8 years old, and he knew she was probably waiting for him. She must be waiting for me, he thought, checking his watch. His boss had asked him to finish an extra task that day, which made him late. With each step, he felt the strain of his hard day's work, thinking about the unfinished tasks at work and the smile he hoped to see on Kelly's face. As he walked through the busy city streets, Jared thought about his daily routine. Since his wife, Amber, started working full-time as a cleaner, he had been picking up Kelly from school every day. Even though he was tired, he loved spending that time with her. When Jared arrived at the school, he saw Kelly playing in the playground. The moment she spotted him, she ran over with a big smile and hugged him tightly. "Dad, you're late today," she exclaimed, her joy easing the burden on his weary shoulders. "Sorry, honey. Dad had to work overtime, but I got here as quickly as I could," he explained. They talked briefly about her day as they walked towards the train station. Her little stories from school and the drawings she had made filled him with pride. Jared held Kelly's hand carefully, not wanting to lose her in the crowd. The city was particularly busy that afternoon, with people rushing to catch their trains and buses. It was rush hour, the time of day when it feels like the world is in chaos. As they arrived at the station, the flow of people grew even more intense. Jared held his daughter's hand tightly as they made their way to the train, his energy fading with every step. The exhaustion of the day was catching up to him. "I just want to get home and rest," he thought. Once on the train, the Kelly sitting beside him, she excitedly talked about her plans for the weekend. "We can make pancakes for breakfast, Dad. What do you think?" she asked cheerfully. "Ah, that sounds great, my love. Let's make your favorite pancakes. We could even put some honey on top," he replied with a tired but warm smile. But the gentle rocking of the train and the warmth of the cabin were an invitation to sleep. Jared closed his eyes for a moment, but then opened them again, worried about his little girl next to him. She lay on his chest, and he began to stroke her hair. The soothing rhythm of the train and the surrounding voices, which had faded into a distant hum, only contributed to the exhausted worker finally succumbing to his weariness. Jared barely noticed when his heavy eyes closed, accepting his exhaustion once and for all, and for a moment, everything went dark. Suddenly, a bump and the sound of someone bumping into him jolted him awake. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir," said the person. Still a little dazed, Jared blinked a few times, trying to get his bearings. But then his heart raced when he looked down and didn't see his daughter, Kelly. His voice came out in an uncertain whisper, clinging to the hope that she was just in another seat. "Kelly?" His voice rose in panic. The man stood up quickly, looking around, hoping to see his little girl playing nearby, but there was no sign of her. The train stopped at the station, and the doors opened. Jared felt a wave of despair as he watched people get on and off, indifferent to his growing agony. He began to call his daughter's name louder and louder, his voice echoing through the carriage. "Kelly, she was here. My daughter, she was here with me." He frantically explained to the passengers around him, confusion and fear evident in his eyes. But nobody had seen her. "Oh my God, Kelly." The father ran down the aisle of the train, pushing his way through the crowd, growing more and more desperate. "Kelly, please. Has anyone seen my daughter? She has brown hair and she's wearing a blue dress," he shouted, his voice laced with emotion. Some passengers got up to help, looking under their seats and calling out for the girl, but there was no response. Jared's heart raced uncontrollably, fear consuming him. When the train pulled into the next station, he stood by the door, looking out, desperately hoping for a miracle. At each new stop, he got out calling for Kelly, his voice becoming more and more frantic, his hope dwindling with every passing minute. Finally, when the train reached its final destination, Jared got off the platform with a feeling of emptiness enveloping him. He was alone without Kelly. Panic turned into terror, tears streaming down his face, each one a reflection of the love and fear he felt for his daughter. "Kelly, where are you?" he murmured almost inaudibly. The platform was full of rushing people, but there was no sign of his precious daughter. For Jared, the world seemed to have stopped. He approached the station security guard, his voice shaking. "Please, my daughter disappeared on the train. She's 8 years old, brown hair, blue dress. Please, you've got to help me," he pleaded, barely able to speak through his sobs. The security guard nodded, immediately calling an employee to notify all the stations. Jared stood there, heartbroken, feeling a mixture of guilt, fear, and helplessness. He didn't know what to do, only that he had to find his little girl. But despite the efforts of the station staff, Kelly hadn't been found anywhere. Not every point in the station had cameras. The technology wasn't as advanced back then. After going to the police station to report his daughter missing, Jared had no choice but to go home with an empty soul. When he got there, his heart was heavy, a whirlwind of emotions consuming him: anger, fear, and above all, guilt. The front door, which had opened so many times to laughter and happy moments, now seemed like a barrier to a world of pain and despair. As he entered, Jared was greeted by the anxious gaze of his wife, Amber. But when she saw her husband was alone, her face turned to pure terror. "Jared, where's Kelly?" she asked, her voice trembling, barely able to get the words out. "I lost her, Amber, on the train." "She disappeared," Jared whispered, his voice laden with guilt and despair. Amber collapsed to the floor, her knees hitting the ground as her body trembled. She watched her husband sobbing, unable to hold back her own tears. "No," she screamed, refusing to accept the reality of Jared's words. "How could you lose her? How did this happen?" The man was shattered, burdened by the terrible mistake that led to his daughter's disappearance. He tried to explain his exhaustion and moment of distraction, but nothing could undo what had happened. It was the worst night of the Stark family's life. In the months that followed, their lives were consumed by the search for Kelly. Posters were put up, investigators were hired, and every day without news was agony. Amber withdrew into sadness and anger, while Jared blamed himself, replaying that fateful day on the train, haunted by guilt. Their once joyful home became a silent reminder of loss, with Kelly's untouched bedroom serving as a painful memory. Jared, filled with despair, confessed, "I failed her, Amber." But Amber, lost in her own grief, had no comfort to offer. Years passed, and though Amber gave birth to a son, Matthew, the joy of his arrival couldn't fill the void left by Kelly's disappearance. The family, torn by grief, struggled to move forward. Amber's health deteriorated rapidly under the weight of grief and stress. Jared, torn between caring for their baby and his sick wife, felt increasingly helpless despite their efforts and the medical support, as if things couldn't get any worse for him. Amber passed away, leaving Jared to raise Matthew alone. Jared took responsibility for his wife's death, convinced it was his fault. But even with that tragedy, he knew he had to be strong for his son. "I promised to take care of you," Mike, he whispered to his little boy, holding him in his arms. His heart was still aching from the loss of Kelly and Amber, both of whom would remain an open wound forever. The following years were a struggle for Jared. He devoted himself to Matthew, offering all the love and support he could, but the shadow of what had happened never disappeared. Kelly's room still remained intact along with Amber's belongings, a shrine to the memory of both his beloved wife and the daughter he never stopped looking for. "Wherever you are, I hope you're safe," Jared whispered every night before going to sleep, as if it were a silent prayer for the daughter who would now be 15 years old. Jared almost succumbed to the weight of grief and the responsibility of raising his son alone. He isolated himself, dedicating his time only to his son and his work. Social life and small pleasures disappeared. His only joy was watching Matthew grow up. Despite the absence of his mother and sister, the boy smiled with the innocence of childhood. 20 years passed since little Kelly disappeared on that train. Mike was now an adult, and Jared tried to move on with life. However, on a cold Saturday morning, something unimaginable happened. Father and son were at home. It was around 11 o'clock a.m. Jared was preparing lunch when he heard a knock on the door. With a sigh, he went to the entrance, expecting to find a neighbor or perhaps a salesman. But when he opened the door, his world stopped. In front of Jared stood a young woman with brown hair, looking nervous but hopeful. Her words made his heart race. "Hi, Dad. It's me, Kelly." For a moment, Jared was speechless. Time seemed to stop and his hands trembled. The woman before him was the grown version of the little girl he had lost years ago. Tears filled his eyes as he realized it was really her. "Kelly, is it really you?" he whispered, overwhelmed. The young woman nodded, smiling shyly. A man stood behind her, also happy. Jared hugged his daughter tightly, a flood of emotions, relief, joy, and sorrow for the lost years, washed over him. But when it happened all those years? On that terrible day, little Kelly was lured away by a woman with a colorful balloon. The woman said, "Come here, little girl. I'll give you the balloon and you can return to your father before the train leaves." Kelly wanted to ask her dad but saw he was asleep, so she quietly followed the woman to the platform. Instead of giving her the balloon, the woman grabbed Kelly and took her away. The woman was part of a child trafficking ring. Kelly was taken to a foreign country and kept captive. The kidnappers planned to sell her, but before they could, Kelly escaped. Lost in a strange city and unable to speak the language, she wandered the streets, frightened and alone. A kind family found her and took her in. They tried to find her real family but couldn't. As time passed, they adopted Kelly, giving her a loving home. She grew up with them but always had vague memories of her real parents. Though she adapted to her new life, she felt a piece of her was missing. As an adult, the young woman met Jacob, a private investigator. They fell in love and got married. Moved by his wife's story, Jacob began to investigate her past himself. It took 2 years of extensive and meticulous searching, but Jacob finally found clues that led them to Kelly's hometown and, eventually, to her father, Jared Stark. Kelly was overwhelmed with emotion upon learning her father was still alive, but also saddened by the news of her mother's death. With her husband Jacob's support, they traveled to her home country for the long-awaited reunion. Nervous and hopeful, Kelly knocked on her childhood home's door, her heart racing. When her father opened the door, the reunion was a powerful mix of disbelief and joy. Tears and smiles filled the moment as they embraced, trying to recover the years they had lost. Kelly also met her brother, Matthew, who had grown up hearing stories about her. Over time, the Stark household began to heal. The most joyful news came when Kelly told Jared he would soon be a grandfather, filling the home with new hope and love. Despite the past pain, the family found happiness again, proving that after darkness, light and love can return. What do you think of this story? Let us know in the comments section. Thank you.